Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Am I talking too loud? Terrific. Thank you for being here tonight, and hello to the people on Zoom. Laura Park is going to be watching the chat so that if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat at any time. Tonight is a really special night. I'm really grateful to be hosting this event um, with Fran Roby and our very special guest. And I'm very grateful to Laura Park for pulling all of this together. When I first came to her with the I when I first came when I first came to her with the idea, I assumed that she would be hosting and I'd just be sitting with all of you. And I'm really grateful she pushed me. So I'm a little nervous, but I know you are all on my side. Dr. Maya, can you hear us okay? Fantastic. All right. So tonight I'd like to light the chalice and read a prayer for living in tension. It's by a Unitarian minister, Joseph Cherry. You might have heard it before. If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy, there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving. And now I'll light the chalice. Dr. Maya, I don't know if you can see this, but we light a candle for the entire event tonight. So choosing to live a very public life for the greater good is, especially when you have two children and a wife in Rochester, yet your work is halfway around the world in South Sudan, is filled with challenges. Yet so much lore, so much mythology is built up around the great leaders in history. And so I can forget that they all started just like me, clumsy, like in the poem I just read, trying to figure out, how do I address injustice? Tonight, we'll explore what it means to be an ordinary man, ordinary woman, who lives their life publicly for the greater good, and what this might mean to our own lives. It is a real gift to have Dr. Maya here tonight to share real experiences about real people and how our racial justice work, fits into the larger context. It is 2 a.m. in South Sudan. Could we just give a round of applause to Dr. Maya? Laura Park suggested I share briefly my own starting point, which was the easily seen racism around African Americans, which we see in the news and read in the newspapers. But then I did a deep dive here at Unity. Our values at Unity are wonder, open-hearted engagement, and courageous action. I realized I wasn't taking action. Soon I realized I was not including Indigenous people, so I took a deep dive. And then I realized I wasn't paying attention to Asian hate crimes, so I took a deep dive. It was so overwhelming. I wanted to take my blanket and put it over my head and just let it all fade away. Fortunately, it led me to political organizing. I work with a group called Isaiah, which is an interfaith group, and they've worked with Unity in the past. And this year we got 30 progressive bills passed. We were shocked. Our whole agenda Paid family medical leave. I practically lived at the Capitol. Affordable childcare. It's astounding. And so, of course, this benefits white people too, but I know my own motivations and my own personal goals around dismantling systemic racist system, one legislative bill at a time. So tonight, let's turn our attention to Sudan. We don't fundraise at Wellspring Wednesday, but later we'll give you a brochure and put it in the chat for all of you on Zoom with information about Dr. Maya and Fran Roby's program, which you'll hear about later tonight. And that will give you more information and it'll show you how to donate if you're moved to do so later. So tonight's agenda is in 3 parts. Dr. Maya will begin with some historical context around Sudan and his experience in becoming a lost boy, finding the refugee camp, and his experience in coming to America and ending up in Rochester. Then we'll open it up for questions, so you don't have to hold them till like 8:30. Then in the next section, we'll hear from Dr. Maya about the conflict that led to South Sudan becoming one of the newest countries on earth. And he'll talk about the current conflict in the region, and we'll open it up for questions again. And finally, I'll introduce Fran Roby, and he will share how he met Dr. Maya, and together they'll share how they started a powerful program in South Sudan, and why Fran, an American with lots of privilege and lots of comfort, chose to throw his hat into the public sphere. And we'll see how all of this speaks to you. To the people on Zoom, again, you can put your chats and comments, your comments and questions in the Zoom at any point. So let's dig in. First of all, Laura, is Jan Circa online yet? All right, then I'm going to throw it over to Fran. Fran Roby has been a guidance counselor for decades, and he lives in Ward 4 here in St. Paul. He volunteers with Isaiah. I volunteer with Isaiah. We're living at the Capitol for a couple of years. And then he tells me about this enormous program he has going on the side. And so I kind of jumped on board with it. And I'm going to have Fran introduce Dr. Maya, and then I'll come up and turn the microphone over to Dr. Maya.
Thank you, Dana. Okay, so my name is Fran, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maya, who has become a good friend. I've known Dr. Maya since 2008, but very briefly, and this is information that's going to be on the trifold that you receive later this evening. Dr. Maya is dedicating his professional life to helping the people of his country. He has a family and a home in Rochester, Minnesota, as Dana mentioned. Although he spends most of his year in South Sudan, living in the capital city, which is Juba. He spends nearly 11 months out of every year there. So this is a challenge for his wife and his children, who are also making a great sacrifice, as is Dr. Maya. In Juba, he spends a great deal of time as acting as the director of the SUD Institute. That's SUDD Institute. If you go to our website, you'll see a link to the SUD Institute, and you will see dozens and dozens of papers that he has authored, research papers, and co-authored, and you'll see many other research papers that his colleagues have authored. And the research and the writing that they do is all about South Sudan. Every aspect of life, from the economy to agriculture to education to public health, every aspect. And then they use that to inform the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Food Bank. So I'm going to move along more quickly. So I will just say that he is a consultant to many, many international organizations, including the United Nations. And he has earned a PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in demographics and sociology. And here he is. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Meyer, we're going to give you about 20 minutes to tell us, put Sudan, the conflict, in context. Why were there lost boys? What was going on? How did you find a refugee camp? What was your experience? What was your experience coming to America, Madison, Rochester? And now you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Such a delight to be with you. It is 2:21 a.m. in Juba. Nonetheless, I'm happy to be attending this particular function. I am grateful for the opportunity to do so, to talk to you, to share my experience with you from childhood to all aspect of my life from childhood to now. But I will start with my life before being displaced from my village to basically different countries in the region before resettling in the US. And so in 1983, just a year after I was born, a second conflict broke out in the Sudan. And I say second conflict because the first conflict was fought between 1955 and 1972. Sudan was colonized by Great Britain. And as that colonization was ending in 55 and 56, South Sudanese were not satisfied with the new arrangement of an independent country. And so they wanted a new arrangement for themselves, either to leave and join East Africa or become an independent country. That was not allowed by the British and Sudanese in the north. And so the Sudanese who rejected this idea were Sudanese in power, not everybody. And the Southerners who were leaders then decided to take up arms against that regime. And so they rebelled and waged war for 17 years, so from 55 to 72. And there were displacements, thousands of people were killed, but an agreement was signed in Ethiopia in a city called Addis Ababa that ended the conflict. And so for 10 years, there was stability in the Sudan, but soon after, the agreement was abrogated by the new leadership in the Sudan. Those who did not find independence of South Sudan worthy, they basically took an initiative to propagate another subjugation. And I would want to say the dissatisfaction comes from the fact that South Sudanese have never been treated as equal citizens with the Northern Sudanese. And so that resurfaced right after the agreement around 1980, 81, and in 83, the Second War broke out. I was just a year old. And a few years later, I was equally displaced. But before being displaced, what was I doing as a child? My job as a child and job of many children right now is, well, things have changed over the years. There are more schools now, so many children are going to school. But during my time after the war, there were no schools. Unless you moved to town, there was insecurity all over the place. So my job was to basically take care of goats, sheep, and cows, even though I was relatively young. And when I was displaced, that displacement came along with the raiding of our cattle. So cows were taken, and many families were displaced. Some displaced internally, some were displaced to other countries in the region, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Congo, and back to North Sudan, in the cities in North Sudan. And so I was privileged to actually go to the city, to go to school. So I was displaced first internally in the Sudan, and then finally to the Kenyan-Sudanese border, and then finally Kenya, and then finally came to the US. But what happened exactly in the process as we were displaced? We were gathered as thousands and thousands of children who did not have parents, and some adults were assigned to take care of us. And along their responsibility was to mobilize an international support through the UN to provide food, medication, and when the opportunity presented itself, some schooling under a tree, and mostly writing in the sand at that time. And so for years, as South Sudanese adults and the UN took care of us, we moved around internally in the Sudan and to other countries before settling in Kenya. And in Kenya, this is where we had most opportunities to go to school. So I had the opportunity to, well, I had started school in the Sudan, but it was not enough. Luckily enough, this program in Kenya enabled a great deal of opportunity for many boys who survived the war. And I want to register that thousands of boys that I was with died from starvation, lack of water, disease, and directly by being killed by the enemy or the Sudanese forces so far. So the lucky ones who ended up in Kenya got the opportunity to go to school. And we spent about a decade in Kakuma refugee camp. You can look it up. It's actually an improved environment now. But in the 90s, when we settled there, it was a dusty, desolate environment with limited resources. It was just dry, limited rain. And we were placed there for a decade with UN supplying some food. But that food was not enough. We had 1 meal a day, and that was basically corn, flour, basically cooked in some water and nothing else. And so you'd have that 1 meal a day. What I did basically to just not pay too much attention to being hungry, with that I started hard. I would go to school and stayed in school until 5 p.m. each day, and I come home at 7. That's when I would have my dinner, and then we'll do the same the following day, every day of the 5 days that the schools function. And that was the story of many children who were resettled in Kakuma. But then God provided another opportunity for 4,000 boys who became the Lost Boys of Sudan. And I want to say the meaning of the Lost Boys of Sudan is basically closely related to the story in what's called the Peter Pan's movie. And this story is quite relevant to that movie in the sense that many of us were displaced without parents and moved across Sudan and across Africa on our own with support from the few elders in the UN. And so when we were found by humanitarian actors, and especially the Americans who were interested in understanding the conflict in the Sudan, they gave us the name, the Lost Boys of Sudan, those kids who were found without their parents. And that program started in 1998, and it got promoted. It started with a small book that was written by a lady who came to Sudan and spent about a year, I think, with USAID, and then went back to Kakuma in Kenya and chronicled the experience of the boys, went back to the US and related that story. And that story was moving for especially religious groups, faith-based institutions, and they pushed for the resettlement of these boys in the US. So by 99, the process has started. And in 2000, the first group arrived in America. I arrived in Salt Lake City, Utah in March of 2001. And you can imagine a transition from a refugee camp straight into a city, a capital city of state, and the experience that was being my first in a city since I was born. And when I arrived in Salt Lake City and I was with other boys, my first experience was exiting the airport. And, you know, some of the gates of the airports open on their own. They are automated. And we ran for our life when that happened. It was just an experience we have never seen. And we thought we were getting attacked and we just ran. We had to be brought back by IRC representative saying that this is how certain things operate in America. You're going to get into an elevator, which you have never seen. You're going to see other things that you haven't seen before. So this is a learning experience for you, but there'll be more for you that you will have to navigate and live with in the process. So in Salt Lake City, I spent 5 years there. I started my schooling at Salt Lake Community College. When I arrived in the U.S., I had just literally finished junior high, and I was, of course, or do some equivalent. So when I arrived in Salt Lake City, I took the GED exams, and surprisingly, I passed at the first go, and was granted a space at Salt Lake Community College for 2 years, and then I transferred to the University of Utah, where I finished my undergraduate degree in sociology. And luckily enough, during my third year, as I was getting my plans to return to the Sudan, I was admitted into a doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin. So I finished the following year and then came back to Southern Sudan then. And at that time, an agreement was signed between the SPLM, which is Sudan's People's Liberation Movement, which was the entity leading liberation struggle for South Sudanese and the Sudanese government. And I was invited right after finishing my college education to come back and help with the transition. And the funding that facilitated my return came from the US government. The State Department gave Southern Sudan $70 million, and I was picked up from Salt Lake City and brought to Southern Sudan, where I spent a couple of months teaching at a high school. And then when I was done, I was, of course, returned back to the US, and I started my doctoral studies at the University of Wisconsin. And that's where I met Fred. First met with his daughter, Bridget, who brought me closer to her family, and I met Fred then, became friends. We have, before putting together this new organization, we worked on another organization that was supposed to provide educational services and water supplies in Southern Sudan, in my village called Akop in Warab State, one of the 10 states in South Sudan. So I spent a couple of years at Madison, but then before I finished my doctoral studies, I was called back again during the South Sudan's transition to statehood, because we had just voted for independence in January 2011. Now, we were to declare our independence in July 2011. And so the office of the president of Southern Sudan called a few of us back to come and help with transition. And the first task that I had in an independent South Sudan was to evaluate the performance of the regional government, which operated for 6 years, from 2005 to 2011. And I was placed at the office of the president for a year to do that work. And we provided insights into the new government by learning from that experience. And so I remember writing a paper on population needs and what could be done to address them. So I was looking at distribution of resources across the states and counties, what the allocations were at that time and what the allocations should be moving forward, depending on needs of different areas. And again, this comes from the fact that I train as a demographer, so I focus a lot on planning and services for the population. And as part of that, we founded the CERT Institute, and the CERT Institute was to provide that analytical support for the government as well as the international community. And as Fran said earlier, I've worked with the government for a couple of years now as a consultant. I have never been a permanent or an employee of the government, and also with different international agencies, the World Bank, World Food Program, UN, FAO, which is Agricultural Organization, UNDP, African Development Bank, and I don't get paid. And I continue to do it. And my job is to change this place so then it does not displace children anymore. It would be a place for emerging generation that's going to be at peace, that will have schools, that will have health facilities, that will have roads, that can have a park to play. And really that has been it for me. So graduating from the University of Wisconsin, I was sought after for faculty jobs, but I declined those opportunities and came back home to help my country. So
Thank you.
we found, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Maya, for that first section. I want to stop for questions because that was so rich with information. So, wow, I was so lost in thought there. Laura is, for the people on Zoom, Laura is watching the chat, and
There is a question on the chat.
great. And this is about the first section, and then we'll get to more modern Sudan.
And the first question is, what happened to the Sudanese girls?
That's a good question, and it always comes up. Should have emphasized that. So there were Sudanese girls who were displaced. Fewer of them, though, got to the U.S. And the reason was that girls had more protection than boys. If a family did not exist, then they would be assigned an elder or somebody who would be a caregiver. Girls are a big deal in the context of South Sudan. We still pay to basically marry as men and boys. And that's what I did. I paid 120 cows to get yar. Fran, I told you that. And so there is a serious protection, community protection. Boys can wander on their own and they can figure things out. Girls are largely protected. And so the few who were released by those guardians who did not have the opportunity to come to the US and even Australia and Canada resettled in the US was that there were 90 of them. And there were 4,000 boys. But yes, there were girls who were displaced.
I have another question from the chat. How did it come to be that so many boys were separated from their parents?
So again, that's another good question. So boys were seen as a force to reckon with in terms of human resources for the war. And so there was actually a targeting for the boys by the Sudanese army. If the boys were found, they would be either taken as slaves or killed. And so parents, where there was no war, parents would be forced to actually just send off their kids to safety, where they would go and have some protection from the SPLA or the SPLM in that regard. And so there ended up being more boys in those camps because of that targeting element from the Sudanese army.
And we can bring the microphone around. Oh, can I? Oh, terrific. Thanks, Laura. What questions do you have for this section of the evening? Yes.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for all of your sharing today. I was wondering, what are the things that built your resilience?
Wonderful.
What are the factors that built your resilience and
That's a
strength?
wonderful question. That's a wonderful question. So different elements. The upbringing of South Sudanese children, especially the boys, is tough. So from when you were 1 to literally when you were 7, you were taught to be literally a man, right? So if you cry, you get beaten up. You're hungry, you must wait until the food is provided. You must go to the bush and take care of goats, even as early as 3 and 4 years old. And so at the early age, you were exposed to that hard life, which was what we faced largely in the bushes. So that's one factor. The second factor is this social cultural element of fictive kinship, right? So I relate, even though we're not relatives, the Sudanese culture encourages supporting one another. And so the boys came together. And that's why I was relating that story earlier, that adults who were not even related to the kids were made to be the guardians, and they took care of the kids. So that element of bonding together. So if I had, and it's still true today, if I have a piece of corn with me, that's all we can eat, I'm going to share it across the group. However much we would have, we're going to have to share it. And so it was so for example, when I got sick, I almost died. I had a terrible diarrhea. I was supported by these other young boys who provided for me. I had a cousin in the group as well, but majority of the people who provided that support were other boys that I did not relate to by blood. And so that element of bonding together, that fictive kinship, provided a lot of support for us. And then the other encouraging factor was that the movement, the SPLM, which led the war, made it clear that if we survived, we should go to school, because tomorrow we will be the leaders of the country. And so as early as at the age of 5, we're told the future of the country rests with us, and we just need to pick up whatever opportunities that come our way to do so, and we must get an education to do that. So I remember in 2004, while we were in the US, John Garang, who was our leader, came to the US and had a conference with us in Phoenix, Arizona. And he, at that time, some of us were already close to getting done with our bachelor's degrees. He recalled his messages around capacity building for these boys, for the country. And so when he came, he said, get your education done, come back and build the country. So those elements provided a lot of strength for us and guaranteed some sort of future down the road that was going to be positive.
Does anyone else have a question about his childhood or his experience in Rochester? Over here. Thank you.
Thank you. Have many of the lost boys been reunited with any part of their families?
Yes. So right after the agreement in 2005, there was now an opportunity for us to return home and look for our families. So many of us were able to reconnect with surviving families. And that's how I reconnected with my family. My cousin, Gabe, who is now a finance manager for World Vision International in Kwajuk, did the same. And it's the same for a lot of people. Unfortunately, some of the boys could not reconnect with their families who were killed in the war or got displaced to other places, such as Egypt and what have you. But because of technology, majority of them ended up connecting with them later.
I have a couple of questions, Dr. Maya. When you came here in 2001 and then 9/11 happened, did people look at you differently?
That's an interesting question. So I arrived in March of 2001, and then I started college in August that year. When that happened, I was actually in class, and professor just alerted us to what had just happened. We I would say in Utah, Salt Lake City, we were not treated differently from other citizens of the United States. In fact, what that did to us was compelled us to actually join the military, the U.S. military, because our understanding of what was happening in America was a reflection of what we experienced in Sudan. And so we wanted to join forces with the Americans to do the best we could to rid America of those experiences as in terrorism, and do the same in Southern Sudan at the time. And so I actually was close to joining the military. I was recruited. I was discouraged in the last minute by another American who told me, look, you can't leave war to come join another war. It doesn't make any sense. But it was a compelling experience for boys to actually.
Thank you very much. We missed the last part of your sentence.
So I was saying a bunch of us joined the military, and we wanted to basically relate to America and do, because there was a close link between the two experiences, the attacks in New York and what was experienced in Southern Sudan. Religion was an element of it in the war between Southern Sudan and North Sudan. Islam versus African indigenous religions, and also Christianity. And so we wanted to respond by joining the military and serve to send a message that South Sudan will not stand by while America is getting attacked. And so we were treated well.
Thank you. That is great to know. I actually have a couple of small questions. So my understanding is that with the boys, you said, they could be killed. And my understanding is that a lot of them would be recruited as child soldiers. Is that true?
Yes, and it did happen. So some of us ended up briefly in the army, within the rebel movement as well. And also, but for the Sudanese army, it was a different case. South Sudanese were not trusted to really lead the fight against another South Sudanese. So it's either you get enslaved or you get killed or get hurt in one way or another. So it was safer to be on the side of the SPLM than you would otherwise be. And so there was that space granted by the SPLM for displaced people, and there were limited opportunities for education within the liberated areas.
Well, that brings me to the question that I brought with me tonight. So what was your experience when you first came to America? You see these doors open, escalators and elevators, and you're carrying all this trauma with you, and Americans are like, glad you're here. Here's McDonald's. Here's snow boots. Was there any therapy for you? I mean, there's so much trauma children are bringing to America. What was your experience with that?
Wonderful question. So as I started with my experience at the airport was not the only experience. A couple of funny experiences. So one of them was snow, right? So by Salt Lake, it snows in Salt Lake City. The first time was snow, scary. And of course, there was support from the churches around the area. There were a bunch of volunteers. There were a bunch of issues with respect to moving in the city, right? Taking a bus, for example, you just never know where you're going. I mean, there's a bus, but where you going? You can end up in another state. And there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion there. Food was not that welcoming for us because American food is very different. American food is sugary, it's greasy. For the most part, that's not what we had in Southern Sudan or in Kenya. Funny enough, one of the greasiest food was my favorite. And I wonder if you would guess what that is. It was pizza. And I literally ate pizza for like a year. It was my best. And it's, I thought it was just a good, it was a good transition with that kind of challenges that we experience with support. But you have a bunch of holidays that you celebrate as Americans. Halloween is one of them. But Halloween is not fun for us when we first got to the US because it's scary.
Mm, mm,
And when we first had it, it was a lot of boys were panicking and
mm.
they weren't sure what it was. July 4th, you have fireworks, very scary, reminds you of gunshots. And so there are a lot of trauma that we brought along. And there were programs created for rehabilitation. And I was lucky to be part of a program at the University of Utah that allowed me actually to express my experience. And I wrote an article about our experience with the boys. And I worked very closely with a sociologist who made it easy for me to talk about my experience. And as a result, I relieved myself of that stress. Some of the boys had to see actually therapists. We also had to get some medical treatments for certain parasites that we got from dirty water, and you name it. But again, transition ended up being good. It took me about 2 years for me to acclimate into the American system. Somewhat,
years,
I was,
Mm.
yeah.
That's amazing. I'm just going to check the time. Oh, we're doing great. Before we move to the next section, are there any questions in the chat? Anyone else here? And we're going to have another 2 sections for questions if you think of one. All right, we're going to move into the next section. And Dr. Maya, before I got up for questions, you were saying about Islam and Christianity. In this section, can you talk about what was the conflict in South Sudan? And then, pardon me, in Sudan, or pardon me, let me start over. What was the tension brewing in Sudan with the religions and all that? And then how did South Sudan come into being? And then if you can touch on some of the other work besides PASS that you're doing. I will tell you, this is a busy man. I was at a dinner party at Fran's house, and Dr. Maya was here in America with his wife and 2 children. And he's the guest of honor, and all of a sudden he had to leave the room because he got a phone call from the World Bank. Like, I don't know how he balances all of these responsibilities. So again, if you can explain to us the religious tensions and the political tensions, how South Sudan came into being, and some of the other work that you're doing, not PASS, we'll get to that in a moment. You've got about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. So the war, so there are 2 layers of this war to talk about. War number 1, it's the war between Southern Sudan and the Sudanese elites in Khartoum, the north of Sudan, which is now an independent country. South Sudan became independent in 2011. And what exactly caused that war? Many factors, and one of them is religion. But other factors which are significant are political and social subjugation, with limited development in the South, with limited opportunities in terms of participation in the government by Southern Sudanese. And then you have the resource element of it, where oil resources and other mineral resources were extracted in the South, but did not benefit the South. Development was happening in the North, it was not happening in the South. And then, of course, religion, Northern Sudan being dominantly Muslim versus the African religions, as well as Christianity. And so that those issues cause tensions between Southerners and Northern Sudanese, and mostly elites who were governing the country at the time. And there were several attempts at peaceful means to resolve those issues, but there was no success. And so, for example, before 55, there was a meeting here in Juba in 1947, which brought Southern leaders, the chiefs, and some of the political elites in the Sudanese government, who were Southerners and some Northerners, coming together to discuss the fate of South Sudan, given how North Sudanese were treating Southerners now that the British were ready to leave. And there was no agreement there that was reached. So 7 years later, the war broke out. But again, those issues were negotiated and they were seemingly settled in Addis Ababa in 72. So Southerners returned, they were given their regional autonomy. But again, about a decade later on, that agreement was disrespected, it was dishonored, and Southerners went back to the drawing board and they rebelled. Now, 1983 war lasted for 22 years. And the agreement that was signed in 2005 had spelled out more a stringent stipulations for the freedom of South Sudan. And right there was a part that allowed for South Sudanese to vote for to secede from the Sudan. And so South Sudanese went ahead with support from the US, Norway, and the UK. We were able to get independence in 2011. So three major issues that caused the war in the Sudan: religion, social and economic subjugation, and then you have resources being used, resources that are extracted from Southern Sudan being used only in North Sudan, did not benefit Southern Sudanese. Then another war broke out after our independence within South Sudan. That was in 2013, and it went on until 2018. An agreement was signed in 2018, and now what we have as a government is called the Government of National Unity under that agreement. And that war was caused by basically tension within the SPLM, competition among Southern elites on who should lead the country, who could do better. And so the party, the SPLM, split. And as a result, instead of containing their tension within the party, it spread across the country and it became a civil war. And as you will read online, that civil war killed 400,000 South Sudanese within the period of 5 years. The previous wars killed millions of people. The one from 83 to 2005 killed over 2 million Sudanese, majority of them South Sudanese. And so this have been the conflicts over the last 50 years in Southern Sudan and now South Sudan, and they are caused by different factors, as I said. So what am I doing now? What else do I do? So as Fran started out earlier, I'm a researcher here at the SID Institute, which we founded in 2011, 2012. But I'm also a consultant for a variety of institutions. And the work that I do there is also largely research. Right now, I am consulting for an international company. It's a development company. It's called NERAS. NERAS is providing support for the government of South Sudan with funding from Sweden. And what they're doing is actually to set up a wastewater system. Believe it or not, Juba still does not have wastewater system just yet. So we use tankers to transport waste to a place where it is treated. And so they are now putting together a system in place, and they have hired me as a social scientist to understand the socioeconomic elements or aspect of wastewater waste management system in South Sudan. I'm also going to be heading to UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, in a few days, and I'll be there as a fellow. My job would be to do research on international investment in education in South Sudan and how that impacts quality improvement in educational sector in the country. I have done work for a variety of other international entities, consulting for USAID in Kenya and in Ethiopia and here. So the list is long, and I'm not going to bore you with that. You can go online and look for some of the materials that I have published resulting from this work. But I'm all over the place. That's what I can tell you. I might come to the US this fall to go for a fellowship, but I might also be asked to go to the UN General Assembly to accompany the government and provide some policy advice while they're there. I'm asked to do that, but they still haven't come through yet with that. So these are some of the things that I'm doing besides PASS.
You are so humble, and I know you're doing a million things. I have to admit, Laura, I made a mistake on the agenda. I did not leave time for questions in this section, so we might have to hold them till the end. Does anyone have a burning question? And I apologize. We've looked at this agenda 10 times and there's not a Q&A section in there. I apologize. I do have a question and I have the mic, so I'm going to ask, I'm not clear on South Sudan is a new country. Refugees are leaving Sudan. So are refugees coming to South Sudan, and how do people feel about that?
Yes, so there is also a war in the Sudan. So after we seceded, Sudan did not become stable, and the war has been ongoing since then. And recently, it intensified, and South Sudanese who moved from here to the Sudan because of the war in South Sudan between 2013 and 2018 got caught up in that war, and so now they are returning in thousands per day back to South Sudan, but also thousands of Sudanese who were displaced coming to South Sudan as refugees. So South Sudan is getting filled regularly every day since April with displaced people coming from Sudan. I did not make that. Yeah.
I apologize.
Go ahead.
And South Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world. So what are they doing with these refugees?
Well, it's yes. So South Sudan has limited development, and it is endowed with a bunch of natural resources. So in a way, South Sudan is rich. It's that the resources are not well exploited. But once you are faced with a conflict such as we have in Sudan, you really can just run in any direction to safety. And so South Sudan has a little bit of stability now, even though there's no food here. People feel like they will be safe here. And there's that cultural connections between Sudan and South Sudan. So Sudanese would rather come to South Sudan and be with their former brothers and sisters. And about a week ago, I ran into a young Sudanese man who had just come with his family. He did not have money. He just ran to me and spoke to me in English. And he said, look, my English is not good enough. You guys are brothers and you have transitioned into English. You don't use Arabic, but can I get some help? I have a child and my wife, and they need my help. So, and I gave him some pounds for himself. So you have Sudanese who are forced to be here because they don't have other place to go.
Thank you. And this gentleman here would like to know, are there any efforts around climate change in South Sudan, given all that they're dealing with?
Good question. So in the last 4 years, South Sudan has been extremely flooded, and thousands of households have been displaced by flooding. And we think that flooding is a product of climate change. And so there have been efforts. The SID Institute is the premier institution in terms of research on those issues. So we have published a bunch of papers related to that and how both the domestic and international system can respond to those. And so there's funding coming from the World Bank, funding coming from other UN agencies, there's funding coming from USAID, Norway, Netherlands, that is going towards that. The issue is that it's never enough. But yes, there are some efforts in place to combat climate change.
Thank you. Well, now we're going to pivot to the last section, and we've heard a lot of heavy stuff. And now we're going to pivot to a solution. So I'm going to turn it over to Fran, and Fran is going to talk about their program. And after he's done talking about it with Dr. Mayai, if you want to explain how you met after your daughter and how you started working together. And then I'll hand out a brochure.
Okay, great. Yeah. So my daughter in 2008, she was attending the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She was majoring in journalism and writing for the Badger Herald, their school newspaper. And they said, go interview this guy. He's in the PhD program and he's a lost boy of Sudan. Bridget didn't know what that meant, but she went to meet him. She interviewed him and wrote an article, and then they really enjoyed meeting each other. And then soon after, we went to visit Bridget, and my wife and I met Ting, and then that was 2008. So then every year or every other year, Ting would be in town and he'd come for dinner, and we maintained our friendship. And then 2 years ago, this month, Ting and I were speaking on the phone, and I think I had just called him to see how things were going. And he had something on Facebook I saw about someone that was in need. And we began talking. And I said, so yeah, what else is going on there? And he said, well, Fran, he said, one of the great problems that we have is that we have tens of thousands of youth, especially youth that live in the country, and most of the population is rural, and they are living in extreme poverty. Now, by the way, this year, South Sudan is rated as the poorest country in the world with a GDP, gross domestic product, of only $561 per person per year. Haiti, by comparison, is rated 27 from the bottom. And their GDP is 3,200 something. I don't remember the exact number, but about 6 times the amount that is created in the economic system in South Sudan. So in any case, Ting said, yeah, he said, we get all these kids going to school. Many of them work hard. They're intelligent. They're ambitious. And they graduate, and that's the end of the road for them, for their education. And they go back to the country, and they live with their family, and they go back out to feed the cows every day, or the goats or the sheep. And he said, it's just tragic because they're going to continue to live in poverty, and their children will live in poverty, and they die from dysentery, and they die from malaria and all these diseases, and their quality of life is very poor, and it's a lot of suffering, unnecessary. And so what about college scholarships? I was a guidance counselor most of my life here in the Twin Cities. So I said, well, what about college scholarships? Why can't they? And Ting was like, well, there's a scarcity of college scholarships. They're just almost non-existent. And the ones that do exist, and you can look on the internet, there'll be a scholarship, and it'll be for students in these 8 countries, and they offer 10 scholarships every year. And so they're extremely competitive, and there's a handful of kids that get them, and then the tens of thousands have nothing, So the good thing about South Sudan is that the government does subsidize the public institutions very well. And so the tuition, what we would consider, is very cheap. At the 4-year public universities, it's only $300 per year for the tuition. This is for the 4-year bachelor college degree program. And then the fees that are charged also are about $150. It works out to about $36 a month to put a student through college, to give them the opportunity to dramatically change the trajectory of their life. So it's like the bang for your dollar is going to go so much farther in South Sudan than it will go almost anywhere else in the world. So Ting was explaining this to me, and then we decided, well, let's see if we can do something about it. And I said, I know Moore and I have some money. We had retired 4 years ago, and we have long-term care insurance, and we've got, Medicare, and we've got a supplemental, the Medigap program that covers everything else that Medicare doesn't cover. And so we're set on that, and we've got some money set aside for emergency funds and this and that, and a little bit for bequeathing some money to our kids. But we're like, but we got all this other extra money. Our kids don't need a lot of money because they're professionals, and they have 401ks they're saving, and so we're like, no, we don't need to just have all this extra money and just save it for our kids. So we paid money to have to get the program started the first year, and also some money from some other people. And we were able to put 33 students through college the first year. That was 2 years ago. And then this past school year, thank you. This past school year, we found other people that wanted to help, and they were able to put another 29 students through. So we got it way up there to about 60 students this year, and that included some of the Murlay students. We included a new group of people that are very, very impoverished in South Sudan into our scholarship program. So basically, I will be giving you one of these in just a few minutes. This is the trifold that talks about our program, just for that you can get more information about the program. And also our website is in the backside. If you have a phone, it's a QR code. You can just boom and go right to our website. There's a lot of information on our website. And a lot of photos of our students and lots of other photos. It's very interesting. We have of the 62 students that we have in college this past school year, we have 51 of them who have sponsors. So that is like really exciting. So 51 of them have sponsors who are paying for their 3 or their 4-year programs. So we don't have to worry about those kids. They're covered. However, we have right now, I checked before I came over here, we have 96 new applicants for this coming year, brand new applicants. Okay. So the 62 that we had in school this year, there'll be about 59 of them continuing. But again, most of them are covered by sponsors. So we're okay with, and we have some people who've made donations, so we can cover those students. But in terms of the new students, here's what we do. Ting is going to be, we're going to meet in Cannon Falls because it's halfway between St. Paul and Rochester. Ting's going to be in Rochester for the next 2 weeks. He's flying out tomorrow to go home, be with his wife and his kids. But the middle of next week, we're going to meet in Cannon Falls at an ice cream shop, and we'll be there for a few hours. And we're going to go through all of those applications and find out who's earned a 2.8 GPA in high school, or who's earned at least a 75% on their national high school graduation exam. We want to give money to students who have a good likelihood of being successful in college. So we have those academic standards. Then we also look at their financial need. And it's very different. When Ting first explained this to me, I was like, what? Because again, I was a guidance counselor for many years. So our kids fill out the FAFSA, and they look at the parents' income, and they look at assets, and they look at, retirement income, well, he said, no, these people don't have money, Fran. They don't have bank accounts. They don't have, we need to ask them how many cows they own, how many sheep do you own, and how many goats, because they're all living in a straw hut. And they don't have cars, and they don't have savings accounts, or anything else, cash. And so, as it turns out, most of our families, the vast majority, own fewer than 20 animals, whether cows, sheep, or goats. And that's all they have to live on. And that's very, very poor, even in South Sudanese standards. That's very, very poor. So, you could hand those out right now, Dina, and you can see there even more information. And I think that's, I'm going to open it up for questions now, right? So questions either on chat or right here in our room here. Everybody's busy reading. Okay. Yep.
So thank you very much. So I was struck while Fran was talking about how this is a story about South Sudan, not as victims. This story here with what they're doing with scholarships, it's not a story about victims. It's about people co-creating what's possible in the future. And Dr. Maya, my understanding, you said something at the dinner party, just like lost boys go back to South Sudan like you to help with infrastructure. These students want to stay there and become lawyers and engineers and stay there, correct?
Yes, except when there are opportunities to study abroad, as we did, they would want to use those opportunities. And we have had a couple of those opportunities. I have a cousin of mine who was displaced to Uganda in the 90s. He studied really well. He went to a Catholic school and graduated with a bachelor's and also got a scholarship to the UK, got his master's in communication management field. And so there are some who have had the opportunity to go as far as the US, and they would come back to help with development as I did.
Yes, I read some of the applications and it's so beautiful what these kids wrote about wanting to be an engineer or a lawyer or, you know, help their country. I did have one more question, but I can't find it here. Okay, well, I want to ask Fran, but Fran, you'll have to summarize. I'm so sorry. So Fran is just an average person, and fundraising is hard. I mean, he's retired. Fundraising is hard. Just briefly, what motivates you to keep doing this work with Dr. Maya?
Okay, great.
Because
Yeah.
because
Okay,
because we can all think of, you know, what we can do and what this drives us to do.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So, first of all, we didn't start fundraising until last September, so it hasn't even been quite a year. And to be honest, the first thing I did in the first 2 months is I called my friends, my relatives, my neighbors, and most of the money that we got, most of the donations and most of the sponsorships are from people I know personally. And then we do have an article from the Star Trib, and Dana will pass that out too, because that is one of the things we did publicly is I called the Star Tribune, and they came out, or the reporter came out, they talked to me, and they called Ting, and they interviewed Ting as well, and they wrote a really nice article, and you can still look it up online, but I did extract it from online and I printed it on it. It's two-sided, by the way. And there's no photos. If you go online, you'll see a lot of photos. So we did get some response from that. We got some donations and we got a few people that sponsored someone. And Ting, this is really only the second fundraising event that we have done, because we did one in December when Ting was here in St. Paul in December, and then we did this here. I'll tell you that in just a minute. Yeah. So, so we haven't done a lot of fundraising yet, but I'm still going around to neighbors. See, I would have done more, except my life has just been really crazy in the last 6 months since January. I had 2 family members that died, and I had a bunch of other things going on, and so I was taking care. My wife and I were taking care of our grandson for a good deal of time. But I'm going to get back to trying to get more supporters, because here's the deal. The bottom line is that my wife and I have some money, and we're sponsoring several children. Youth. We also sponsor children from other organizations too, but we're doing as much as we can financially. So it's like, if we're going to be able to give these new applicants an opportunity to go to college and dramatically change their lives, it's not going to be because of me or my wife. It's not going to be because of Ting, because Ting doesn't have any extra money. It's going to be because of whoever else wants to do that. So I do need to get out, and I need to start doing that. And I'm happy to do that. It's just that I just haven't been able to in the last 6 months. Yeah, you look like you have a question. Okay, great. On our website, you will see a list of the colleges. The question is, what colleges do these students attend? Do our students attend? So we had 62 students during this past school year, and that include the earliest students. And most of them are going to the University of Juba, which is the mothership institution for the entire country, but others attending other public institutions. And we have also about a dozen students, a little more than a dozen at private universities. Catholic University has probably at least 6 or 8, about a half a dozen at IE, AYII University. Those tuitions are higher, considerably higher. Instead of the 300 and with 150 fees, it's more like about, for IE is about $2,400 including tuition and fees. But compared to that to the United States, the average public institution, four-year college in the United States, $26,000. That's the average. Now that includes $10,000 for tuition, $16,000 for room and board, and only $2,400 at a private university in South Sudan. And remember, only $450 at a public university in South Sudan. Okay, Dana's pointing to this. You are invited. This Sunday, Ting is going to be at my house. And I live about 3 blocks from the University of St. Thomas. And you all are invited to come and meet Ting in person, and his wife, his beautiful wife, and articulate and very intelligent and wife, and everyone else that's going to be there. You are invited. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have all sorts of things to drink and eat, beer and wine, good beer, good wine, and also lots of non-alcoholic beverages, as well as lots of treats and hors d'oeuvres and things. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be outside. And Ting is going to talk again about some other things. And that's it.
Thank you so much. All righty. Very good. No, this is mine. Sorry. Oh, you're welcome to take that.
That's yours.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
It's just like that.
I know. Same font and everything. Well, I want to tell you some good news. The generosity team here has approved our nomination for the PASS program to receive a Sunday offering in October. So we're very excited about that. That will help sponsor several students. And if anyone would like to talk with me more about my anti-racism work or your own challenges in defining or refining your anti-racism work, please just come on up and get my phone number after we're done. And I want to thank everyone here. Oh, Laura, I should have asked you, is there a question on chat? Great, thanks. I want to thank everyone here and on Zoom for coming tonight. I hope to see you at Fran's this Sunday. And I want to thank Fran for all the work he's doing behind the scenes. And it's now 3:30 in the morning for Dr. Maya, and it has been a true gift to have Dr. Maya with us tonight. So let's give him a rousing thank you. Woohoo! Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And have a wonderful sleep.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everybody. Have a good night.
And Dr. Maya, we hope you have a safe travel here back to the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening, everyone.
Thank you.